Hi, everybody. Here is our somewhat tardy overview for the week 3 reading and videos. There was a little bit less to do this week because, of course, you all had the assignment due this Monday. And you're also going to be submitting your grade contract, your midterm grade contract reports by the end of the week. So there's a little bit more to do. So I cut back on the amount of content that we're going to be talking about. But of course, it's a very important subject matter for this chapter and for these videos, which is essentially the Renaissance. I mean, this is essentially what's happening to English during the period that we know as the Renaissance. And just to quickly run through chapter 3 of McCrum et al., I would identify 5 key points here that they run throughout the chapter. The first is, of course, the role of the printing press, which can't be overstated. And I mean, living as we are through the transition from print to digital textuality and literacy, we can all appreciate how important it was as European society as a whole, and certainly in England, moved from from manuscript culture to print culture. Popular education. So even though, and I said in the last video, I mentioned how majority literacy is not going to be achieved until the late 19th century in many industrialized countries, but that's sort of like functional, that's not meaning functional literacy, that many people during this time period can read insofar as they can recognize printed words on signposts and things like that. I mean, you all understand that there's a distinction between that and then being able to read long form texts. And that's what actually does start to pick up during this time period as you get things like grammar schools being established because of the rise of an urban middle class, right? There's a strong socioeconomic connection here. Increased communication as being another important thing, and this is in part linked to the technology of the printing press, because you start just having regular small texts printed, particularly what are known as broadsides, which is just taking one of these big folio pages. I can't gesture, but they're about 1.5 feet by 1 foot in size. They're huge pieces of paper, and printing on either one side or both sides, kind of the news of the day and rumors and gossip. And these were the forerunners of newspapers. So these certainly, alongside just sort of more long-form printing projects, allow for ideas and information to be disseminated more quickly. This alongside innovations in road building, land transportation, and sail, right? We're heading into a very significant age of sail. So all of those things allow information to travel faster. And of course, language, right? And I mean, this is one of the points, looking ahead to the Rob Words video, he mentions the importance of people intermingling as something that's going to hasten the great vowel shift. And throughout everything that we're talking about, I cannot stress, I'm going to talk about this more with the Rob Words video, but I cannot stress enough the importance of the great vowel shift throughout all of this. Specialized knowledge is something that's identified within the McCrum chapter as being significant, where you get a lot of Latinate terms entering. We've had the 0 and 1st and 2nd and 3rd periods of Latin transmission, and now we get an additional 4th period of Latin transmission where Latinate and Greek terms, during the classical humanist rediscovery of Greek and Roman texts during the Renaissance, they start very self-consciously importing these terms, and these are a lot of the most high, adumbrate words like psychology actually itself as a field, right? And as a term emerges during this time. And that, of course, is a Greek word. And we know that because of the silent P at the beginning of psychology. And it speaks to the fact that it is during this period that we really start to see the emergence of jargon, right? Sort of professionalized language, and thinking about that as what we're going to call a sociolect, which is distinct from a dialect, where a dialect is a regional variation of a language. A sociolect is a class or group-based definition, a sort of common class of people across the entire society speak this particular kind of language. And for the Renaissance, you had these inkhorn terms, which scholars, and smarty pants were throwing around. And so then the final sort of thread that runs throughout the chapter is self-consciousness about language, that because of class distinctions and also nationalism, we are in the Renaissance or early modern period, and nationalism begins to emerge as a powerful force globally. And so, Rob Words is going to talk about this, but it's also talked about significantly towards the end of chapter 3, where, British, especially English, but then British versus French national pride becomes important. And now not only is French no longer an official language in Britain, it's actually actively disdained by certain groups of people, and that this is a self-conscious way that people go about wanting to change the language. And next I want to talk about the Other Words video about spelling inconsistencies in English with Dr. Erica Brzozowski. This is a NPR-based video blog, I guess. And she talks about a number of important things, first of all, emphasizing the inconsistency of language. And I love the fact that she pulls out the I before E rule, right? Because it's for those of you who have taught any elementary grade English classes, right? I mean, that's the sort of classic, this is how you're going to learn spelling. And she immediately points out the fact that there's all sorts of exceptions to it. Now, I have to point out, and this actually looks ahead to the Rob Words video as well, that there are rules for why those particular words that don't obey the I before E rule do that. But they're very complex. They have to do with the consonantal and vowel vocalic sounds following the diphthong, which of course, the whole that rule exists. I mean, you have the I and the E precisely because there's diphthongization. And if you don't know, just to clarify this for those of you who might be hearing this for the first time, a diphthong is simply any vocalic sound or any cluster of vocalic sounds in a word. So there is actually two vowel sounds in that one syllable. There, air, right? And this is one of those, where you play around with the IPA symbols and you start hearing the distinct sounds. And diphthongs cause all sorts of problems, and we have a lot of them in English, and it's one of the characterizing features of English. I want to make a shout out, because I love them, to the runic alphabetic letters that were in Anglo-Saxon that we lost. She talks about win and thorn, which stood in for W, and thorn was the unvoiced TH sound in a word like thin. There was also eth, which you may have seen somewhere. That was the voiced TH sound in a word like there. And also yog, which is the sound that is going to be replaced either, interestingly, by Y or by GH in a lot of modernized spellings. So I wanted to mention, she talks about hypercorrection, and this is really a great phenomenon. Not great, but I mean, it's a notable phenomenon that starts happening in the Renaissance. McCrum et al. In chapter 3 actually end by talking about a really famous example of this, which is apostrophe S is itself an example of hypercorrection, where adding S to form the possessive or the genitive, to use the more strictly correct term for the nominal case of a word that's turned into, meaning possession, adding an S sound was just what you did in Anglo-Saxon. But it was hypercorrected. It was falsely extrapolated back to the Renaissance to assume that it was adding the contraction his. And they talk all about this in McCrum, but I just wanted to connect those things. That's another example of hypercorrection that Dr. Brzozowski doesn't talk about. And then she ends by just talking about how a lot of attempts to phoneticize spelling in the English language have failed, but we're seeing it again from a ground up perspective with phonetic spelling on the internet, like cheeseburgers and like words like that. And we'll have to kind of keep an eye on it, because a lot of internet slang has been adopted officially in venues like Webster's or the Oxford English Dictionary. And then finally, just to look at the Rob Words video, I basically picked this. It's a fine video. He duplicates a lot of the things that Dr. Posofsky talks about in the Other Words video, as well as in McCrum et al. But I basically picked out this one because he goes into the deepest dive about the Great Vowel Shift. He mentions Otto Jespersen, which is actually a name you should know, very famous linguist who was the person who, through hard, what we call textual criticism, and philological research, like going back and looking at reconstructing how words had been pronounced down through the centuries, he was able to actually find this systemic vowel shift pattern that the Rob Words narrator talks about in great length. And he actually, you will notice, by the way, I encourage you to do this, he actually references the same IPA vocalic mouth diagram, right? That weird trapezoid that actually does represent what it represents is the internal cavity of the human mouth. And that, of course, is incredibly important for how vowel sounds are made. Because as I said way back in that phonetics lesson in the first week, vowel sounds are just unrestricted flow of air through the mouth. You vibrate your vocal cords, and then you have unrestricted airflow. So all vowels are different simply by how that cavity is shaped, right? Along with the lips, whether it's rounded or unrounded. And so he runs through how I'm not going to duplicate what he says because he does it a lot better, but pay attention to that video because he goes into a deep dive for how the Great Vowel Shift actually took place. He speculates, and we don't know. He admits this, towards the end of the video, that the source of the Great Vowel Shift, we may never know what caused it. But some of the things that hastened it included the Black Death, immigration patterns, and I mentioned that back with McCrum talking about transportation and communication advances. Fashion, I would actually link that back to the self-consciousness about language is really what he's getting at with that people being more aware of the way that they speak. And then the printing press, he throws in at the end, not as a cause of the Great Vowel Shift, but as something that instantiates, actually concretizes the language as the Great Vowel Shift is taking place. And this, of course, is what leads to countless spelling inconsistencies in English, as all of the sources that we had for this week acknowledge. Finally, I just wanted to, he talks about silent words, but how some people pronounce them, the letters and the L's of folk and almond and palm, that I think I usually pronounce all those L's. One that I've actually noticed, and maybe this can be discussion in Discord, is cold, which I usually pronounce the L, but I've in the Ohio Valley, and kind of in Appalachia, code. It's that you actually hear that L sound elided in that word. So feel free in Discord to talk about any of those sorts of inconsistencies between spelling and how people pronounce words versus how they're actually spelled.